Imagine buying your dream home, your own land, no HOA, complete freedom. But then out of nowhere, a self-appointed HOA dictator, a full-blown Karen, decides that your property is her business. Fake violation notices, endless complaints, and even 911 calls, all because you dared to live on your own terms. But what happens when this power-hungry neighbor finally goes too far? Stick around, because this is the story of how one entitled Karen tried to control my land, and how she got exactly what she deserved. Hello beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. A peaceful neighborhood, or so it seemed. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, children rode their bikes without a care, and everything appeared picture perfect. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other, exchanged pleasantries at the mailbox, and occasionally borrowed a cup of sugar. But beneath the surface of suburban serenity lurked a force of nature unlike any other. Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, the guardian of neighborhood standards, and an enforcer of rules no one had agreed to. Armed with a clipboard, an ever-present scowl, and an attitude bigger than her house, she patrolled the street as if it were her personal fiefdom. Her favorite pastime? Complaining. About everything. The first encounter with Karen was almost laughable. The protagonist, a calm and reasonable homeowner, had just moved into their new house, a property not part of the HOA. They had chosen the location precisely to avoid the ridiculous bureaucracy that often came with homeowner associations. But Karen saw things differently. To her, the entire street fell under her rule, HOA membership or not. One afternoon, as the protagonist was tending to their front yard, Karen made her grand entrance. Clad in a pastel tracksuit with a whistle around her neck, she stood with her hands on her hips, staring disapprovingly at a garden gnome near the walkway. That, she announced, pointing at the innocent ceramic figure, is not HOA approved. The protagonist, suppressing a smirk, responded, I'm not in the HOA. Karen gasped as if they had just confessed to a federal crime. That doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want. This is a respectable neighborhood. Her disdain only grew as she began listing off other so-called infractions. The shade of the mailbox, the color of the front door, the length of the grass, half an inch too long according to her untrained eye. It was clear that Karen saw herself as the last line of defense against chaos and disorder. The protagonist shrugged. Well, seeing as I'm not in the HOA, I think I'll just keep living my life. Karen narrowed her eyes. We'll see about that. And with that, the battle had begun. Karen took her self-imposed duties to a whole new level. If there was a minor inconvenience in the neighborhood, she was on it faster than a raccoon on an unsecured trash can. It didn't matter that she wasn't an elected HOA official. She felt like she was, and in her mind that was good enough. The first sign that things were escalating came in the form of a note taped to the protagonist's front door. It was written in aggressive cursive, the kind that looked like it belonged on a strongly worded letter to the editor. Notice of violation. Dear homeowner, it has come to my attention that your property does not meet the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. The following issues must be corrected immediately. Your grass is overgrown and an eyesore. Your front door color does not match the community guidelines. You have an unauthorized decorative object, the gnome, in your yard. Failure to comply may result in further action. Karen, Neighborhood Watch Coordinator, unofficial but highly respected. The protagonist stared at the note, then burst out laughing. Not only was this completely absurd, but it was also entirely unenforceable. There was no HOA jurisdiction over their property, and Karen had absolutely no authority to issue such demands. Still, out of curiosity, they asked a few neighbors if they had received similar notices. The responses were mixed. Oh yeah, she does this to everyone, said Tom from next door. Last week she gave me a written warning because my recycling bin was too visible from the street. She made me move my bird feeder, another neighbor added. Said it was attracting undesirable wildlife. It was literally just birds. Karen's reign of neighborhood terror had been going on for years, and most people either tolerated her antics or ignored her completely. But the protagonist wasn't one to back down. Instead of removing the gnome, they added another one. Then another. Within a week, their front yard had turned into a full-blown gnome village, complete with a tiny ceramic welcome sign that read, HOA Free Zone. Karen was not amused. The next morning she was on the protagonist's driveway, hands on hips, staring at the gnome collection like it had personally offended her. "This is a direct violation of the neighborhood's visual harmony," she declared, her voice shaking with outrage. "I think it adds character," the protagonist replied. Karen pursed her lips. "You think? That's the problem. There are rules here." "No," the protagonist corrected. "There are rules for the HOA members." "Which I am not." Karen wasn't listening. Instead, she took out her phone and snapped several photos of the gnomes, muttering under her breath about how this was going straight to the neighborhood committee. Later that day, another note appeared on the protagonist's door. This time it was typed. "Second notice of violation. You are now being formally warned that continued disregard for community standards will not be tolerated. Failure to comply will result in a formal complaint." The protagonist chuckled. A formal complaint to whom? The neighborhood gossip circle? The universe? A few days later, things took an even more absurd turn. Karen showed up with a measuring tape and started inspecting their lawn. She crouched down, eyeing the grass like a scientist examining an alien specimen. "I knew it," she exclaimed triumphantly. "Your grass is over 3 inches. Okay," the protagonist said. And, Karen huffed, "This is unacceptable." The protagonist shook their head. "Karen, I don't know how many times I need to say this. I am not in the HOA. You have no authority here." Karen's face twitched as she struggled to process this truth. But this is a neighborhood. There are standards." "Sure," the protagonist replied, "and those standards don't apply to me." Karen stomped off, but not before snapping another series of photos, presumably for her imaginary violation database. The protagonist thought that would be the end of it, but they had severely underestimated Karen's dedication to her role. Over the next few days she escalated her tactics. She started calling in complaints to the actual HOA board, only to be told repeatedly that they had no jurisdiction over the property. She began harassing other neighbors, trying to rally them into a crusade against the gnome invasion. Most of them just nodded and ignored her. She even tried to stage a neighborhood intervention, where she gathered 2 of her equally nosy friends to try and pressure the protagonist into compliance. But the moment Karen truly lost it was when she decided to take things to the authorities. One evening, as the protagonist was grilling in their backyard, a police cruiser pulled up to the house. A bemused officer stepped out and walked toward the driveway. Sir?" the officer said, barely containing his smirk. "We got a complaint." The protagonist raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Karen?" The officer sighed. "Yeah. She called 911. 911. She said there was a serious neighborhood violation happening." The protagonist gestured to their peaceful backyard. "This?" The officer shrugged. "Look man, I get it. This is ridiculous. But since she called, I had to show up." Karen was standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching triumphantly. She clearly expected the officer to lay down the law and force compliance. Instead, the officer turned to her with a very different expression. "Ma'am," he said, "this is not a police matter." Karen gasped. But he's breaking HO rules." The officer sighed. "He's not in the HO." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The officer turned back to the protagonist and shook his head, clearly exhausted from dealing with people like her. "Have a nice evening," he said before heading back to his car. The protagonist raised a beer in a mock toast as Karen stormed off, her face red with rage. This was far from over and everyone knew it. The protagonist could have ignored Karen entirely, but where was the fun in that? Dealing with her nonsense had become a game. One with no real stakes, just endless opportunities for passive-aggressive retaliation. After all, if Karen was going to make their life difficult for no reason, they might as well make her job as self-appointed neighborhood dictator as frustrating as possible. At first they tried to reason with her. They knocked on her door, armed with logic and a calm demeanor, fully prepared to have a rational discussion. That was their first mistake. "Karen," they began, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I understand you have concerns about the neighborhood, but I'm not part of the HOA, so their rules don't apply to me." Karen gasped as though they had just admitted to arson. "Not apply? Not apply?" she sputtered. "But the community must have order. If we just let anyone do whatever they want, we'll have absolute chaos." "Karen," the protagonist repeated slowly, "I am not." the HOA, but the neighborhood does not have universal HOA coverage. My property is separate. I have the legal right to ignore those rules. Karen's face twitched, her mind unable to process a reality where someone could defy her perceived authority. Well then I will be speaking to the HOA board about changing the rules. The protagonist fought back a smirk. Good luck with that. Clearly reasoning with her was pointless. It was time for a different approach. The first step in their subtle retaliation was a strategic increase in all the things Karen had previously complained about. If Karen was going to act like the gnome collection was a personal affront to civilization, then the gnome population was going to explode. Over the course of the next few days, more gnomes appeared on the lawn. Some were small and traditional, others were absurd, like the one wearing sunglasses holding a tiny beer bottle. A few were even positioned facing Karen's house as if watching her every move. The day she finally noticed was glorious. "What is this?" she screeched from the sidewalk, clutching her pearls like she had just witnessed a crime. "More gnomes." The protagonists sipped their coffee, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, those? I thought they really brightened up the yard." "You're doing this on purpose." "Karen," they said innocently, "I'm simply expressing myself within my legal rights as a homeowner." "You believe in personal freedoms, right?" Karen's jaw clenched so tight it was a wonder her teeth didn't crack. But the gnomes were just the beginning. Next came the violations that weren't actually violations but would infuriate Karen nonetheless. A flagpole went up. Nothing controversial, just a generic flag that read, "Not in the HO." The protagonists deliberately parked their car exactly 1 inch closer to the curb every day, just to see if Karen would measure it. They installed festive holiday lights, out of season, in the middle of summer. It drove Karen insane. "This is unacceptable," she fumed. "This is a community." "Exactly," the protagonist agreed. "A community where people can enjoy their property however they want." Karen's threats escalated. She warned that she would personally fine them, which was not legally possible. She claimed she would take this to the city, which resulted in city officials politely telling her to stop wasting their time. She even tried convincing the actual HOA board to annex the protagonist's property into the HOA, an absurd legal process that had zero chance of happening. But perhaps Karen's most hilarious attempt at control was when she wrote up an official-looking document titled Neighborhood Guidelines Agreement and tried to trick the protagonist into signing it. She appeared at their door, document in hand, trying to sound authoritative. "All residents must sign this to acknowledge their commitment to neighborhood harmony." The protagonist took one glance at it and laughed. "Nice try, Karen." Karen's face turned red. "What do you mean? This is a legal document. Did you run this by an actual lawyer?" Karen hesitated. It doesn't need a lawyer. It's common sense. Everyone else has signed it." "That's funny," the protagonist mused, flipping through the pages. "Because there are no signatures on here. Not even yours." Karen snatched the document back, huffing. "You'll regret this." Somehow they doubted that. With Karen's frustration growing, the protagonist knew she was bound to escalate. The fake notices hadn't worked. The intimidation hadn't worked. Even the HOA board had told her to back off. Now the question was, what would Karen do next? Whatever it was sure to be ridiculous. Word spread quickly about the ongoing battle between Karen and the protagonist, and soon the entire neighborhood had picked sides. Some fully supported Karen, though they were few and far between, mostly other self-appointed rule enforcers who thrived on unnecessary drama. But the majority? They were either too amused by the situation to intervene or secretly rooting for the protagonist. The first sign that the community was fully aware of Karen's antics came when Tom from next door casually mentioned it while grabbing his mail. "Man," he chuckled, leaning on the fence, "I don't know what you did to set her off, but I haven't seen Karen this mad since old Mrs. Henderson planted a bush 1 inch over the property line." The protagonist grinned. "Oh, you mean my gnome army?" Tom's eyes widened and a slow smile spread across his face. "That was you. Dude, that's legendary. My wife and I have a bet on how long before she tries to file an official complaint to the mayor." "Wait," the protagonist said, "that's an option?" "She's done it before," Tom confirmed, shaking his head. Apparently she thought a neighbor's unapproved Christmas decorations were bringing down property values, so she wrote a whole letter demanding government intervention. The protagonist laughed. What happened? The mayor's office sent her a generic response thanking her for her concern and advising her to pursue local resolution. Which of course meant absolutely nothing. It turned out that Karen had a long history of petty disputes with just about everyone. The Petersons down the street got a complaint because their wind chimes worked too loud. The Johnsons had to repaint their fence twice because Karen claimed the color clashed with the neighborhood's theme. Someone's cat had once been accused of trespassing on Karen's lawn. Yes, a cat. Now, however, Karen had a new nemesis, the protagonist, and she was escalating her campaign. Some neighbors found the whole thing hilarious. They'd watch from their porches with popcorn whenever Karen went on one of her rants. Others, particularly the older residents who had endured her nonsense for years, began quietly rebelling. One of the most unexpected moments of solidarity came from Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. She didn't say much, but one morning she strolled by the protagonist's house and nodded approvingly at the gnome collection. You know, she said in a low voice, I have a couple of those in my garage. My late husband loved them, but Karen told me they worked tacky. The protagonist's eyebrows lifted. Mrs. Kowalski, I think it's time those gnomes saw the light of day. That afternoon, 3 more gnomes appeared in her yard. The next morning, the Jones family added a couple to their front steps. By the end of the week, the neighborhood was starting to look like a gnome convention, and Karen was absolutely losing it. But while most neighbors were entertained by the drama, there were still a few who sided with Karen. Mainly other busybodies who seemed to believe that a well-manicured neighborhood was more important than actual human enjoyment. A small faction of them started whispering at HOA meetings, clearly trying to find ways to take action. A couple of times, Karen tried to gather them in her driveway for a strategy session, but hurt supporters were quickly losing enthusiasm. You don't understand, she whined to anyone who would listen. This is about standards. If we let one person ignore the rules, soon the whole neighborhood will fall apart. Karen, sighed one of her dwindling supporters, he's not in the HOA. There's literally nothing we can do. Karen refused to accept this reality. Which is why, in her desperation, she made her most ridiculous move yet. She started staking out the protagonist's house. One evening, the protagonist noticed a suspicious figure lurking near the bushes across the street. They turned off the porch light and squinted. Yup. Karen. With binoculars. They couldn't help but laugh. Did she really think she was some kind of secret agent? What was she even hoping to accomplish? Deciding to have a little fun, the protagonist reached down and moved one of the gnomes an inch to the left. Karen gasped audibly from across the street. The protagonist moved it again. Karen scribbled furiously in a notebook. At that point, the protagonist couldn't help themselves. They turned and gave a slow, exaggerated wave. Karen ducked behind a bush. This woman had completely lost it. The final straw for the community came when Karen started calling the actual police over neighborhood violations that weren't even violations. The first time she called because she claimed the protagonist's excessive decorations were a disturbance. The officer who showed up was already exhausted. Ma'am, there are no laws against decorative gnomes. The second time she called about unauthorized parking, even though the protagonist's car was parked perfectly legally. By the third call, the officers didn't even bother getting out of the car. They rolled down the window side and said, Karen, stop wasting our time. The neighbors, now fully fed up, decided to take matters into their own hands. At the next HOA meeting, even her own allies started backing away. Karen, this has gone too far, one of them admitted. You're calling the police over yard decorations. It's embarrassing. But, Karen, it's over, someone else cut in. You need to let it go. Karen's lip trembled. For the first time she realized she was losing control. But she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Karen's desperation reached new heights. After losing the support of her usual busybody allies and being publicly dismissed by the HOA and local authorities, she became even more erratic. She was no longer just enforcing fake rules, she was out for revenge. It started with petty tactics. The protagonist noticed small inconveniences that could only be Karen's doing. Their trash bins were mysteriously knocked over on pickup days. A neighborhood complaint email mysteriously included their name in a totally false accusation of playing disruptive music at night, despite them being asleep by 10 p.m. Even their mail seemed slightly tampered with, though nothing was ever missing, just suspiciously moved. But the most ridiculous escalation came when Karen attempted the pettiest legal maneuver ever, filing a formal property dispute. One morning, the protagonist received an official-looking letter from the city's zoning office. At first it was confusing. They hadn't applied for any permits or made changes to their property. But then they saw the name listed as the complainant. Karen. The claim? Karen insisted that part of the protagonist's property, a small strip of land near the sidewalk, was technically within the visual jurisdiction of the HOA, despite it being legally outside of HOA boundaries. She had attempted to argue that because it bordered HOA property, it should be subject to HOA rules. It was the single most laughable legal argument ever made. The protagonist called the zoning office, where a tired-sounding clerk sighed and said, "Yeah, we've been getting a lot of calls from this Karen person." "Do I need to do anything?" the protagonist asked. "No," the clerk said. "It's completely baseless. We have to notify you since she submitted a formal complaint, but legally she has no claim to your property. If anything, she might be the one getting fined for wasting government resources." The protagonist couldn't help but grin. But Karen wasn't done yet. Her next tactic? Trespassing. One morning, the protagonist woke up to find Karen on their lawn with a ruler. She was hunched over, measuring the grass as though she were conducting a critical scientific study. The protagonist stepped onto the porch, sipping their coffee. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" Karen jumped like she'd been caught committing a felony, which technically she had. I'm ensuring compliance," she snapped. The protagonist set down their coffee. "Hey, let me make something very clear. You are trespassing on my property." Karen scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm merely performing a civic duty." "Karen," the protagonist said, crossing their arms, "leave my property or I'm calling the police." Karen sputtered. "You wouldn't dare." The protagonist took out their phone and started dialing. For the first time, Karen looked nervous. "This is harassment," she muttered, backing away. "You're the one causing problems in this neighborhood." And just like that, she scurried off, gripping her ruler like a defeated general retreating from battle. But Karen's true downfall came at the next HOA meeting. Even though the protagonist wasn't in the HOA, they decided to attend after hearing that multiple neighbors had finally had enough and were submitting their own complaints against Karen. By the time they arrived, the small meeting room was already buzzing with frustration. "Karen has gone too far," someone was saying. "She's making our neighborhood look bad. She called the police on a gnome," another person scoffed. "She tried to file a property dispute against someone who isn't even in the HOA," Tom added, shaking his head. Karen, sitting stiffly in the front row, looked completely stunned. She had spent years intimidating this neighborhood into following her imaginary rules. Now suddenly everyone was against her. When the HOA president, an older man who had clearly been dealing with Karen's nonsense for way too long, stood up to speak, his exhaustion was evident. "We have received numerous complaints about Karen's behavior," he began, rubbing his temples. "This includes harassment of non-HOA residents, frivolous complaints, and misusing HOA resources." Karen shot to her feet. "I have done nothing wrong. I have only ever acted in the best interests of this community." The president held up a stack of paperwork. "Karen, you have personally submitted over 100 complaints in the past year. More than the rest of the HOA combined." Karen's mouth fell open. That's because I care." The president didn't even look up. "And in doing so, you have violated multiple actual HOA rules, including unauthorized use of HOA funds for personal grievances." A murmur spread through the room. Karen paled. "Wait, what?" The president sighed. "Karen, effective immediately, you are being removed from any unofficial or self-appointed positions. You do not speak for the HOA. Additionally, due to the excessive nature of your complaints, we are issuing a formal warning that any further frivolous reports will result in fines." Karen gasped as if someone had physically struck her. "You can't do this," she shrieked. I am this HOA." "No, Karen," the president said, barely concealing his smirk. "You were this HOA. Now you're just another resident. And one more complaint from you and we'll be filing harassment claims against you." The silence was deafening. Karen sat back down, stunned. She had lost. And worse. The protagonist knew she had never looked more defeated. The next morning, something miraculous happened. For the first time in years, Karen was nowhere to be seen. No stakeouts. No fake violation notices. No phone calls to the police. She had finally been silenced. And the neighborhood? It had never felt more peaceful. Karen's reign of terror had finally come to an end, and the entire neighborhood could feel the shift. The air seemed lighter, the birds chirped louder, and the neighborhood felt free. For the first time in years, people could make simple choices without fear of a passive-aggressive note appearing on their door the next morning. A few days after Karen's humiliating HOA defeat, the protagonist walked out to retrieve their mail and was met with the glorious sight of Karen furiously removing her unapproved holiday decorations. That's right. After years of issuing complaints about other people's minor infractions, Karen had been hit with her own HOA violation. Tom strolled by at just the right moment. Well, he said, smirking. Would you look at that? Karen's face turned bright red. I was going to take them down anyway, she snapped, clearly aware that half the neighborhood was watching her. Sure, Karen, the protagonist said, sipping their coffee. Totally voluntary. But the real kicker? Since Karen had been removed from any unofficial authority, she was now just another resident, which meant that she had to follow the HOA rules to the letter. And suddenly, the very same HOA she had weaponized against everyone else was now enforcing the rules against her. She got written up for having a non-HOA-approved mailbox, using an unapproved shade of beige for her house trim, leaving her trash bins out longer than the designated time window. Each violation came with a fine. Sweet karma. The neighborhood, once terrorized by Karen's antics, took full advantage of their newfound freedom. The Petersons put their wind chimes back up. The Johnsons painted their fence whatever color they felt like. Mrs. Kowalski's gnomes proudly returned to her yard. And as for the protagonist? Well, they made a special addition to their lawn. A giant inflatable gnome, one that stood over 6 feet tall. Karen nearly had a stroke when she saw it. She stormed over, her face a picture of pure outrage. You can't do this. The protagonist crossed their arms. Why not? This is not appropriate for the neighborhood, she shrieked. Oh, they said, pulling out their phone. Let's check the HOA guidelines. They scrolled through an actual copy of the HOA rules. Something Karen had clearly never actually read. Nothing about inflatable decorations outside of holiday restrictions. So I guess it is allowed. Karen stomped her foot like an actual child. But, Karen, Tom said from his porch, grinning, maybe you should file a formal complaint. Half the neighborhood laughed out loud. For the first time ever, Karen had no power. She stomped away, fuming, but she couldn't do a thing about it. And that was the best part. Over the next few months, Karen mellowed out. Maybe it was the embarrassment of her downfall. Maybe it was the fact that nobody took her seriously anymore. Or maybe she had finally realized that all her years of policing the neighborhood had amounted to absolutely nothing. She still scowled at the protagonist whenever she walked by, but there were no more fake violation notices, no more police calls, no more HOA threats. And then one day it happened. Karen moved out. A for sale sign appeared in her yard, and within a few weeks she was gone. The day she officially left, the neighbors held a block party. The protagonist stood by the grill, flipping burgers, when Tom raised his beer in a toast. To the best neighborhood improvement we've ever made, he said. Karen leaving? Someone asked. Karen leaving, Tom confirmed. The entire block cheered. As the sun set on the first truly peaceful evening in years, the protagonist leaned back in their chair, watching the glow of the neighborhood lights. The gnomes stood proudly in their yard. The grass grew exactly as long as they wanted it to. And best of all, there wasn't a single clipboard-wielding, power-hungry Karen in sight. Life in the neighborhood was finally normal again. Without Karen lurking behind bushes, measuring grass, or filing bogus complaints, things felt lighter, almost as if an invisible weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. Neighbors who once kept their heads down in fear of a passive-aggressive note now openly chatted in their front yards. The local kids ran around without being scolded for excessive noise. Porch decorations flourished, lawns varied in length without consequence, and, most importantly, no one had to deal with pointless 911 calls over ceramic gnomes. The protagonist relished their newfound peace. Mornings were quiet except for the occasional sound of wind chimes, which, thanks to Karen's absence, had made a glorious comeback. No more Karen patrols. No more official neighborhood notices taped to their door. No more HOA board meetings turning into her personal dictatorship sessions. And best of all, no more ridiculous encounters that left them questioning their sanity. A few weeks after Karen's departure, the protagonist received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Kowalski, the sweet elderly neighbor who had once been a silent victim of Karen's reign. She stood on the porch holding something in her hands, a special garden gnome. "This one belonged to my husband," she said with a small smile. Karen always hated it. Said it was too flashy. The protagonist took the gnome and inspected it. It was a beautifully tacky thing, bright red, holding a tiny fishing rod and wearing an oversized grin. "I think it's time he found a new home," Mrs. Kowalski added. The protagonist grinned. "Oh, he's going front and center." That afternoon, the honorary gnome took its place in the yard, standing as a final tribute to Karen's failure. The neighbors loved it. Tom stopped by with a beer. "That thing is hideous," he said approvingly. "I know," the protagonist replied. "It's perfect." As the months passed, Karen became nothing more than a legend. A cautionary tale about what happens when someone takes their love of power too far. New neighbors moved into Karen's house. A lovely couple who, blessedly, did not carry a clipboard or issue unsolicited rulebooks. And just like that, the protagonist's victory was complete. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat back on their porch, surveying the peaceful neighborhood. The gnomes stood proudly in their spots. The grass grew freely. The mailboxes remained unregulated. And with a satisfied sigh, the protagonist smiled. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood finally felt like home.